But before we do either of those things, we'll stop for a moment and have a word of prayer. So, if you'd pray with me. Father in heaven, we thank you for the day that we have today. We thank you for this time. Again, Father, we are grateful that we can come together every week to study from your word, to discuss it with one another, that we may better understand you and your word and your will. We ask that you would bless us as we do so, that we put you first and make you the center of the thoughts and discussion that we have. We are grateful for all that you have done and will do. But we are most grateful and thankful for your Son, Jesus. We pray these things in Jesus' name. All right, Psalm 114. I got a swig of water and everything. Excuse me. Oh, if I switch it to on, it will work better. Indeed. When Israel went forth out of Egypt, the house of Jacob from a people of strange language, Judah became his sanctuary, Israel his dominion. The sea saw it and fled. The Jordan was driven back. The mountains skipped like rams, the little hills like lambs. What ails you, O sea, that you flee? You, Jordan, that you turn back? You mountains that you skip like rams, you little hills like lambs. Tremble, you earth, at the presence of the Lord, at the presence of the God of Jacob, who turned the rock into a pool of water, the flint into a fountain of waters. Short and sweet, 8 verses. What is this psalm about? The power of God? Yes, certainly. Exemplified in a particular way, but absolutely. Perhaps more broadly, topically, generally, what kind of psalm is it? If we were to categorize it. A psalm of praise. I think absolutely it is a psalm of praise. Praise for God. It certainly fits in with the fact that we have a series of psalms of praise. If we were to give it something else, maybe a historical psalm. The entirety of the psalm, essentially, is taken up with recounting a particular event from the history of Israel, which is what? The Exodus. Yes, the Exodus from Egypt, and then the traveling to the Promised Land. Now, obviously, it doesn't deal with it in detail. 8 verses, some of them repeating themselves. This is not just a truncation, but not even a summary, but this is just a snippet, right? Just a brief mention almost of the Exodus. But it's interesting in several ways about this. What is different about this presentation of the Exodus? The way that this is presented in this psalm, or the way that this is described, how does this differ from other times it is mentioned in the Bible? Specifically within the Old Testament, maybe. Please.
It says that Jordan turned back,
Yes.
not the Red Sea.
Well, both, in fact, are mentioned. But yes. It's okay. This wasn't obvious to me. I came across this in reading about it, and I have the problem that a lot of us have of being very close to the text. In other words, this has been a companion, a constant feature in my life, all my life, because I was raised in the church by people who were raised in the church, who were raised by people who were raised, like, you see what I'm saying? Like, this has been a theme or constant presence, and sometimes it's difficult to step back and look at the Bible and compare it in a way that is looking at it with new or fresh eyes in some ways. The presentation of the Exodus here is less familiar. What do I mean? That is, it is presented as if it were not necessarily a story that was already known to the hearer. It's just a subtle kind of difference in the way that it is talked about. That this is something that might be new. It is not a reminder. It is not remember the story of the Exodus. It is not remember what happened to your forefathers. It is instead phrased as, let me tell you a thing. Here is a story you may not know, almost. Now, it doesn't say those words explicitly, but and it is subtle. I was dubious about this when I first ran across this idea. But I think upon reading and reflection that I buy it. That this is a story that begins, we read in the first verse, this is the NIV now, it says, when Israel came out of Egypt, the house of Jacob from the people of a foreign tongue. This is almost like starting a story. Once upon a time, Israel was coming out of Egypt, which is the way you begin a story for someone who doesn't know a story. When you're telling a story to someone for the first time, you're not saying, you should remember this, or let me remind you of how the Exodus worked. Rather, it's phrasing it as a tale to be told, as it were, anew. Anyway, if you don't find that as peculiar as me or interesting to me, that's fine, no big deal. But the first mention of God is actually in verse 2, in the pronoun. It's actually, the NIV makes it explicit, God's sanctuary, Israel, his dominion. The original text just uses pronouns. And he does not get an explicit mention by name until verse 7 out of these 8. It is an implied presence of God through most of this psalm, rather than an explicit one. And far be it from me to criticize those who are more intelligent than I when it comes to translation. I think that translations do it a disservice, for example, in the NIV, in verse 2, when they make it explicit there. That it is perhaps more essential to think of God or to have God be a somewhat shrouded presence in the psalm till the reveal near the end. Poetically and in a literary sense, I think that would work better. The way the original author wrote it, really. But why mention both Judah and Israel in verse 2? Judah became God's sanctuary, Israel his dominion. Yes, sir.
Isn't Judah a smaller portion of Israel?
Yes, Judah was one of the 12 tribes of Israel.
It would be like, just to give a paraphrase, would be like the house, and Judah would be like the place where he goes to rest.
Okay. This is an excellent point. This may well be what is being done here. So there is a distinction being drawn between the place where God's temple is, the temple in Jerusalem, in Judah, God's dwelling, versus the land, right? Israel, all of the parties in the land. This is an idea which I like and I lean towards. There is another way to think about this that some commentators will actually point to as being different. Can you think of what that might be? Judah versus Israel. After the kingdom split. Yes, some people will point to this and talk about this as being an indication that the psalm is written later, right? That this is a later psalm coming after the split of the kingdom into the northern kingdom, generally called Israel, and the southern kingdom, generally called Judah, as a way of saying that even though there are still two kingdoms, it is the singular God whom they both serve, whom they both ought to owe their fealty to, right? So that Judah is God's sanctuary, Israel is dominion. They are both, though divided politically, united in a theological sense. Possible. I tend towards more the kind of first idea myself, particularly because this is poetic. It's a song, right? He's writing this as a way of repeating himself, but using fresh language as a way of keeping the hearer interested and engaged. Judah is the sanctuary, Israel, the dominion, as a way of forming a parallelism, which the Psalms are full of. What's my next note? Yeah, this one. There's also possible that this is wordplay. This is certainly not something that I worked out on my own, being as I do not read or speak Hebrew, but I am told that there is a sound association between the way that you say Israel and the word dominion, and between Judah and the name of God, Yahweh, which I can see, knowing a little bit about it. Judah does not have that J sound, right? It's more of the yah of the Y sound that we use for things like Joshua, Yeshua, Yahweh. Judah is probably closer to Judah. So I can see that being the case. Possibly a dual purpose. A skilled poet or a songwriter can layer these kinds of meanings. So doubling up on the significance, enjoying the play on words, the association of sounds, particularly sounds that begin words. If we cast our minds back years into the past when I first started talking about Psalms, does anybody remember what I said was one of the important things to remember about the way that Psalms, that poetry works in Hebrew versus the way it works in English? I made the comparison to Anglo-Saxon as well, in the great poem of Beowulf. It's okay if you don't. As I say, it's been years, literal years at this point.
Did you say that they use a lot of alliteration?
Yes, alliteration. The beginning sounds of words are more important to them for their poetry than the final sounds. In English, we like rhymes. We like the last part of the last part of the word to sound similar to the last part of another word. That's how we do poetry. That's what sounds, to use one of my favorite words, mellifluous to our ears. It's pleasing. It's musical. We like that. Not every language and culture does that. The old Anglo-Saxons in the poem of Beowulf don't do that. They used to do it with the beginnings of words. They want the words to sound with the same at the front, known as alliteration. And the Hebrew language and Hebrew poetry often uses that mode. So we look at these and we don't go, that's not obvious wordplay. But that's from an English language perspective. From a Hebrew language perspective, if you have similar sounds at the beginnings of words, that's the way you do wordplay. That's the way you make words associate with one another. Again, we do a little bit of it in English, but it's not the preferred method. So, all right, I think that's, I was about to say, I promise that's the last linguistic note, but I shouldn't do that. There might be another one here that I'm forgetting that I put in. Probably the last one. It's only 8 verses. What's unusual here about the descriptions in verse 3? We have descriptions of water in verse 3. Got it in one. Very good. The sea and the river are not described as passive, right? This is what we would expect, that someone acts upon the river, that acts upon the sea and makes it do something, causes it, and the sea or the river is passive and is affected by God. But the description doesn't work that way, does it? What does the description actually say? What does the sea do? It actively discerns and behaves as if it has agency. The same way with the Jordan River. It behaves with agency. This is not normally how we would describe the events of the world, right? We don't say that the hurricanes choose to go to Florida because, everybody loves Disney World. That's not what we say, right? That's just where it went. The hurricane happened in Florida. The river flooded in a particular place, but it didn't choose to flood. It occurred there, right? It's more passive language. And the author chooses not to do that. Follows it up with the same sort of thing in verse 4, describing, did I put this in the next note? Well, fleeing, being driven back. In verse 4, where he talks about the hills and the mountains. Again, behaving with some sort of agency. Acting. Very unusual way to describe these kinds of things. There is some connection, that some commentators see, between water and creation. I admit, I myself am not fully sold on this idea. But take it for what it's worth, it is a common idea that I ran across. The idea of referring to the world in this way is drawing links in creation between the creation of the world, right? The Spirit of God moving over the face of the waters or the deep. The association of water with creation and God's action. This is the creation of Israel as a nation, the giving them of the promised land. They are brought out of Egypt through the waters by God's will and action into the promised land, and they are now a nation that has been created by God. As I say, I'm not 100% sold that this is what's intended, but I see where they're coming from. It's possible, sure. I don't want to hurry anybody on from the waters before you're ready. Is there something else that I'm missing? Something else that could be said here? I don't want to. All right. There's also, and I think this is a little bit more plausible, an association with God's action and triumph over the gods of the Canaanites. Why might this be an association that we could make in particular here? Why would referring to the water of the ocean, or the sea, I guess, the river and the mountains be associated with triumph over the Canaanites and their gods? We've talked about it before. It's not really a trick question. Not trying to fool anybody. The Canaanites worshiped gods that were gods of essentially nature. The sea god, the thunder god. They worshiped gods that were natural or that were in some sense contending with natural forces. So the idea of a Canaanite worshiping the chaos of the ocean is contrasted with the power of Yahweh, the power of the real God, to control that chaos, to bring order into the chaos, to be in control of the mountains, where they think of the storms and the rains originating from and coming down. The idea that God, Yahweh, the true, only real God, is more powerful than the gods of the people in the land they are to inhabit, and in fact, has full and total control over them. In fact, some of the Baal myths speak of triumph of their God in conflict with these things. The contrast here is that God does not have to contend. There's not a fight. God doesn't have to struggle to overcome the water. When God appears, the water flees away. When God is present, they bow in submission. They take themselves away of their own volition. God is the creator and has full and sovereign authority even over the elements of nature. There's not a power struggle. It's nothing to compare. There's no conflict. There can't be a conflict between God and what he has created because God is too far elevated. He is too far above. It is not even worthy of the name of struggle. They flee away in his presence. There's a strong, and this is the association I think is probably more apt for what the author was going for. Again, my opinion is that this, rather than the creation myth, is what is being gone for here. This is the idea that the author is trying to convey. God, through his power, has taken his people from bondage, from a foreign land in Egypt. He has brought them here, and through his power, he cannot be gainsaid. He cannot be stopped. He cannot be challenged. What God wills occurs. And this is exemplified in the Exodus itself and in the conquest of Canaan. What is meant by a skipping mountain?
I imagine
Earthquakes, yeah, I think that's a strong contender. That's probably what it is. In fact, is this referring to a specific event?
And for me, it's speculation, but based on what my limited knowledge is of the way the earth is right now
Mm-hmm.
and the flood, I believe that when God ended the flood, that he moved the continents, and that's what created
Oh, okay.
Mariana Trench, I think it's called.
Sure.
Yeah, and that's the reason, because the Mariana Trench, according to science, is the reason why the world can never be flooded with water.
Oh, okay. It's too deep.
I mean, that's just my opinion. I mean, because when he's moving stuff, and unless he decided he didn't want to, it would also create mountains.
Right, right. I think that's certainly true. I agree that God in his divine power has shaped the world the way it is. I think he's actually making a more specific reference to the Exodus, however, right? In keeping with this theme of what's going on here, the psalmist in this case is actually talking about a particular event from Exodus 19. This is Exodus 19:18. It says, "And Mount Sinai, the whole of it smoked, because Yahweh descended upon it in fire, and its smoke ascended as the smoke of a furnace, and the whole mount quaked greatly." This is during the Exodus, at the time they come to Mount Sinai. It's immediately after this. Did I put this in the next note? Yeah. Immediately after this that God gives them the Ten Commandments. And I think that when he's talking about this, the mountains skipping like rams, the hills like lambs, that he is talking about a particular event along with the other two particular events of the dividing of the sea and the stopping of the Jordan. He mentions those, and I think this specifically probably harkens back to God descending onto the mountain and causing them to shake. The psalmist is making a direct reference to an actual event from the Exodus as part of his exposition here, as part of what he's saying. God gives them the Ten Commandments after this, and they are witnesses of what happens in the presence of God. Even the mountains tremble and move when God arrives. The things that you should think of as being almost the most fixed, the most immovable, cannot resist the mere presence of the divine. Their identity then as a people and a nation under God is formed in this place. Right? We can assign it to different points in time. I think the Exodus as a whole is probably what's broadly meant in this psalm, the idea of the forming of Israel. But we could even draw it to a specific point with the dispensing of the law and the commandments, the covenant with God that occurs at Mount Sinai, that they are between the two events with the water. They're having this moment where the mountains are trembling, and God makes them his people at this place. He makes them the people into a nation and forms them so that they will live in the chosen and promised land as his chosen and people of the promise hereafter. These are the kinds of supernatural events that occur at world-changing moments. What is it that occurs at the resurrection of Jesus Christ? Or excuse me, I should say, at his death. At his death. We have an earthquake, right? The curtain of the temple is torn in two, right? You have this supernatural darkness that falls over the world. I'm sorry. Okay, yeah. You have these events that happen, right? The darkening of the sun, the shaking of the earth, the dividing of things, in this case the temple curtain instead of waters, but the same sort of principle, I think, is at work. When God is made manifest, when God is present, the natural world cannot help but react. Creation cannot help but respond. What is Jesus' message to the people that criticize on Palm Sunday when he's entering into Jerusalem?
Even the stones will cry out.
If the people were silent, the stones would cry out. Nature cannot resist acknowledging its creator. I think this is kind of this theme of this psalm in some ways, that this is the sort of thing that must necessarily occur. So why these questions in 5 and 6? Are we taunting someone? Seems strange. Taunting the mountains? Taunting the river? The Red Sea? What's the deal with these questions? Yes, sir. Yeah.
Sometimes the writer will ask questions of the things in his writing to get the people to think.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, I think it's to drive the point home in a different rhetorical way. Yeah. In the same way that we have at the beginning the repetition of Judah and Israel as a way of repeating for emphasis, using slightly different language and terms as a way of maintaining that person's interest and not being just simple and plain repetition, but a poetic repetition, we have it again. To drive home the point of that this did happen, and why did this happen? And then he moves into, in fact, the answers for this afterwards. It is the presence of God, right? This is implied by the next two verses talking about in 7 and 8, that it is the presence of God that causes this to happen. God is the author. We have a similar repetition. Tremble, O earth, at the presence of the Lord, at the presence of the God of Jacob. We have the word presence mentioned twice. Presence of the Lord and the presence of the God of Jacob. Why here? I think there's a slightly different twist on this repetition. I think it's because of how God is identified. Not only is he God, the true God, the one God, he is specifically a particular kind of God, the God of Jacob. What was Jacob's other name? Israel. He is the God of Israel, of the descendants coming from the line of Jacob, the people who are now dwelling in this land, the people who God had led out of Egypt, the people who God walked through the Red Sea, the people who God took to the mountain that trembled and gave the law to, the people who God took through the Jordan River and helped them by conquering the people of the land on their behalf. The earth trembles at this God, and this God is the God of Jacob, the God of Israel. The final one, 8, is a very abrupt ending. It just cuts right off this psalm. There's nothing to it once we have this last verse. There's no coda. There's no call to praise God. There's no call to follow him. There's no mention of the benefits or drawbacks, whether to follow or to not follow, right, as we get in other psalms. It simply ends, and it returns to the themes of earth and water. These are two things that we've carried through the entire way. It says, he turned the rock into a pool, the hard rock or the flint into springs of water. What do we have this final verse here for? What is it intended to convey? Why are we revisiting these themes?
Again, illustrating the power of God.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Illustrating the power of God. God's supernatural power. God's extreme, his ultimate control over the elements of nature. That the earth itself is transformed into water. That these things are entirely within God's power and control. That he does act in a supernatural way to benefit his people. The things God does cannot be resisted, even to the point of transforming the very foundations and materials of the world we inhabit. The rules that apply to us do not apply to him. He is unconstrained. We are constrained. And I think ultimately, again, at the end, I think this might be, is it my last one? It was my last one. Good. It's the one I wanted to end with. The world cannot help but respond to the presence of God. I think that this, as well, is one of these themes that runs through this whole psalm. That as God enters into the world and interacts with the people in the world and the things of the world, that there is no possible way to resist responding to that. Acknowledging God. We acknowledge God either through our acceptance and our belief and our faith, right? Our willingness to be subject, or through our rejection of him. One or the other. But there is no neutrality. There is no sitting on the fence. There is only some response to the presence of God. All right. Only 8 verses. But anything I missed, anything I moved past too quickly, anything that was brilliantly illuminated early on by something that was read later, we need to go back and revisit now. I'm a little bit before my time, maybe a lot before my time, 10 minutes. That means there's time today. I try not to allow this, but there is time if you want to register a complaint today even. Not just a question or a comment, but I can actually entertain a complaint. Do it now. It might be weeks before I have time for this again. All right, well, if you don't have any complaints, then I suppose you can all have an extra cup of coffee and hopefully a cookie. I didn't go in there. I don't know what's on offer, but something I'm sure. Thank you all for your time and your attention this morning.